President Trump unveiled plans to raise tariffs on foreign imports of steel and aluminium. If you don't have steel, you don't have a country, you might recall him tweeting. Yesterday, surrounded by steel workers, he made good on that promise and signed the measures into law, claiming that the industry had been ravaged by aggressive foreign trade practices that were, he said, an assault on the United States. They are expected to take effect in 15 days' time. Let's hear what he had to say.
Today, I'm defending America's national security by placing tariffs on foreign imports of steel and aluminum. We will have a 25% tariff on foreign steel and a 10% tariff on foreign aluminum when the product comes across our borders. It's a process called dumping, and they dumped more than at any time on any nation, anywhere in the world. And it drove our plants out of business, it drove our factories out of business. And we want a lot of steel coming into our country, but we want it to be fair, and we want our workers to be protected, and we want, frankly, our companies to be protected. By contrast, we will not place any new tax on product made in the USA. So there's no tax if a product is made in the USA. You don't want to pay tax? Bring your plant to the USA. There's no tax.
President Trump. Well, the UK's International Trade Secretary Liam Fox appeared on Question Time last night. He said he would be travelling to the United States next week to meet his US counterpart.
The way that the United States is going about this is wrong, because they're doing it under what's called a 232 investigation based on national security. And for the UK, it's doubly absurd, because we are only responsible for 1% of America's steel imports. It's 5% of our tonnage by steel that we produce here. It's 15% by value. The reason there's a difference is that we tend to produce very high-value steel, some of which can't be sourced in the United States, and will simply push up the price of steel there. We also make steel for the American military program. So it's doubly absurd that we should then be caught on an investigation on national security.
Well, that was Liam Fox. Well, joining me now is author and consultant Ted Malloch, who is also a supporter of Donald Trump. Welcome to the programme. Do you think the President's making the right move?
Yes, and it's been some time in the making. I call it a kind of PPE move, which you'd understand. It has to do with politics on one hand. We're in the midterm elections. If you noticed who's behind the President when he makes this announcement, it's working class steel workers and aluminium workers from those Rust Belt states who need to vote in favor of the Republicans for them to stay in power during the next congressional election. The second thing is philosophical. He promised to do that in his campaign, so he's following through on a campaign pledge. The last is economic. There is an economic reason for doing this.
And what is that? That
is that China is basically dumping steel in international markets. There are about 2 billion tons of steel made, 800 million coming from China. They're dumping them, and it's affecting global markets. So we're going to knock that down. Right.
Do you accept that, Ian Martin, that this is a good trade policy for the United States to pursue?
I can understand the politics of it. I don't think the economics really make any sense. And I think what troubles me about it as someone who's pro-market is that pro-market people tend to look to the United States for a lead. And beginning a trade war in this fashion could have all sorts of unintended consequences if others respond. Should just qualify one thing, though, which is we're talking as though we in Europe don't use tariffs, but of course the European Union has a 72%?
74.7.
Thank you. On Chinese steel. So the European Union has been playing this game as well. But having said that, I mean, I thought that Trump was actually, with the tax cuts, I thought, well, while I'm a Trump skeptic, I thought he was starting to get somewhere economically, and I think this could set back a lot of that progress.
Right, and it's the beginning of a trade war, potentially. I mean, the European Union, the Vice President has said that in the wake of Trump's decision on steel tariffs, the European Union, or the Commission, will continue preparatory work on potential rebalancing measures. Is that really going to help the United States, a trade war?
Well, I don't think it's a trade war. I don't think it will be blown up to that proportion.
Well, it will if they retaliate. retaliate.
Well, there'll be some tit-for-tat retaliations on things like, Jack Daniels whiskey, peanut butter, and Harley-Davidson motorcycles, so Mr. Juncker has said. The real thing that's coming down the pike, though, and this is significant both in Europe and in the UK, and the President intimated this yesterday, and he has said it outside in other speeches, is the potential for significant tariffs. In other words, mirroring tariffs on automobiles.
Right. Now, what impact would that have? Because that's a much bigger deal in terms of the UK.
So the EU tariffs on US automobiles is 2%. The US, it's 10%. The US is 2%. So if we were to just change that to the mirror image, it would dramatically affect the German automobile industry. It would also affect Jaguar Land Rover.
Right. I mean, Rachel, that would have a real impact here and on, German car makers. What can be done by the British government, who's said to have a special relationship with the US?
There's one more reason not to be so reliant on the US in our post-Brexit reality. Look, one of the things that I find objectionable about right-wing authoritarians like Trump, and it is a very long list, is this misdiagnosis of what is ailing the economy. It's not globalization per se that is a problem. We lived in a joined-up world. That is the reality. It's a neoliberal economic policy that has ravaged people's lives, that has destroyed communities, that has gutted out and hollowed out economies. It's got nothing to do with tariffs. It's a political choice to run an economy in a particular way, and we can reprogram it to run in a different way. It's just that this particular neoliberal system of running economics has chosen not to.
Right. What do you say to that?
Well, we've had elections in the United States, and we've elected this president. He's hardly an authoritarian. He's just made peace, or started a peace process on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
We're going to talk about that in a moment.
So he's hardly an authoritarian. This was part of his campaign to basically bring back manufacturing to American industries. This is a national security issue. Steel is rather important. Aluminium, as you call it, also important. This has nothing to do with authoritarianism.
And isn't he just fulfilling political promises? I mean, to some extent, you could argue, Rachel, that Jeremy Corbyn also wants to have an economic policy that is going to support local industries, would also like to actually support and subsidise steel industry here if he became Prime Minister. I mean, in a way, these are just different ways of dealing with a same problem.
Well, no, because one is telling lies and making false promises. I mean, let's look at how localisation, what it could look like in the UK. One example of that is the Preston model, the local council in Preston, Lancashire, which has seen that, a local government spending, when it's spent locally, creates more wealth in the local economy than if it were outsourced. And so, that is one way. It's got nothing to do with tariffs. That is one way of reviving a local economy. It means local businesses can thrive. They employ people. Everyone pays tax. The businesses pay tax. And the economy locally is revived. That has nothing to do with tariffs. That is a political decision to reprogram an economy to work in a way that benefits people and not corporations.
But it has benefited people. I mean, the process of trade liberalisation after the Second World War, which was advocated by moderate centre-left politicians and by free market politicians, turned into globalisation, which, of course, I'm concerned about some of the extreme effects of that. But it has globally had the most extraordinary impact. It has lifted at least 1 billion people out of poverty.
It's created the biggest wealth inequalities as well. I mean, I don't think trickle-down economics has been proven not to work. Well, I think the problem is wired into the system.
Okay, well, let's try and compare the Chinese economy in 1950 or now.
Your point is perfect.
Lots of state investment
It's done miracles for the Chinese economy. We've moved 350 million people out of extreme poverty in China to middle-class citizenship in China. But the cost of that has been the cost of jobs in the Rust Belt in the United States, in the hollowed-out parts of England, and in Western Europe.
Well, let's talk about
a trade-off.
Let's talk about the relationship with the UK. Is the UK a good friend of the United States?
Absolutely.
Right. So will there be an exemption for the UK?
Well, are you part of the European Union?
Well, at the moment, but is there going to be an exemption?
We're working on that.
If you leave, then we'll make an exemption.
Right. So is that now the trade-off, to coin a phrase, that the UK might get an exemption once it leaves the EU? Or would it be better to stay part of the EU, a big trading bloc, and use those and support those retaliatory measures?
Well, I voted to leave, but I didn't vote to leave thinking that this utopia of loads of trade deals being out there and that somehow some massive trade deal with the US is going to solve Britain's economic problems. Most of its problems are domestic. Exports are 20% of the economy, and about half of that is the EU and half of that is the rest of the world, led by the US. I don't think in the short term, certainly in this context with the US president who's doing what he's doing, I don't think there are going to be that many trade deals, certainly in the next 4 or 5 years.
Right. I mean, you've said once Britain leaves the EU, but if this friendship and this relationship exists now, why can't there be an exemption, as you're giving to other countries, to the UK?
Well, because you'd have to give it to the whole EU, and we're not about to do that.
Right. So, but do you think there would be...
We have given an exception to Mexico and Canada, but you heard the President say yesterday that's only an exception if, in fact, we come to terms on NAFTA. If we don't come to terms on NAFTA, then we have leverage, and, in fact, the same tariffs will apply to those two countries.
Right. It also says that countries which meet or fail their defence commitments to NATO, well, Britain meets its defence commitments to NATO.
There are only 5 that do, so we can tick that box.
Right. So would you be confident that the UK could get an exemption? Or is there any point to this special relationship if there's going to be no special treatment for the UK in the future?
Well, we'll see what Mr. Fox accomplishes when he goes to Washington this week or next week. But my guess is that there won't be an exemption for the UK.
And what do you say about Liam Fox's view on trade, on the high-grade steel that you get from the UK, which you wouldn't be able to get in the US?
Well, once those industries come back in the US, it will be available in the US. There are places in the US where those things have been decimated,